Welcome back to Ethics of Negotiation, Conflict Resolution, and Peace Building. This week, I would like to talk a bit about what I see as the oddest ethical issue. If you go to our course description in the syllabus, you will see the ethical issues that are being introduced and prioritized in the course. And I hope you're taking notes and learning these concepts because they are quite central to our field. And the one I'm going to focus on today is referred to as cultural competence. Now, the definition of cultural competence varies from profession to profession. If some of you are social workers, you have your own definition. NCRP does not have a single definition, but as you read the Code of Ethics at the end of each of the real-world case studies in holding these truths, you are going to see ethical language that relates. For example, the ability to build a facilitative relationship and trust with whoever your parties are. Cultural competence is obviously at the heart of such a statement. How do we bridge cultural difference, cultural experience, cultural perspective about us, the other, in most situations, and I'll explain that in a minute. It's very tricky for most students of NCRP. And one of the reasons I am encouraging you to actively attempt to do your best, and you're also welcome to share your incomplete answers with me and each other on a weekly basis, because I'll certainly help you with clarifying questions and developing mastery of our skills. I'm encouraging you to do it because past students have reported when they've done that, they have discovered their own prejudice, their own biases. And that is critically important for not only cultural competence, but power balancing, impartiality, several ethical requirements for NCRP. Now, I had mentioned in a previous lecture that negotiation is pretty much anything goes. The means justifies the ends. But in my experience, it's nearly impossible to negotiate a cross-cultural difference unless you are prepared to be the ugliest negotiator in the world today, the most exploitive, manipulative, or, and I hope this is true for all of you and our NCRP community, you are prepared to open to other cultures, other communities, other people, learn enough about them to be able to bridge difference and start learning about each other and then negotiating what's in everyone's best interest, the true win-win. Now, with mediation, let me talk about my own experience, because this is a handbook for multicultural dispute resolution. My peace-building work has involved students and communities from about 80 different countries, including with Fulbright support, helping the Arab world start the first master's program in peace building, not only the first master's degree in the Arab world, but a multi-ethnic, a multi-religious program, so important for Middle East peace building, for those of you who have familiarity. I'd like to tell you a little bit of my story, and you are always welcome to approach me via email or arrange a phone conversation, even stop by my office for a meeting so we can continue this conversation over a lifetime. I think you all appreciate it's critically important in our world today. It's becoming increasingly important. Now, I have a family history that is multicultural, multilingual, not so much multi-religious, but a very open family in terms of others' religions, which is critical to cultural competence, that we not be judging and putting others down without knowing them as human beings. I was raised in a progressive, my father will joke that he is the child of raving Norwegian socialists, because he in his aging process has become more and more like them, more and more progressive, less conservative. I feel myself quite fortunate. 3 languages were spoken in my family. I was not fortunate enough to be encouraged to be multilingual like my nieces and nephew, who each speak at least 2 and some 3, 4 languages. I think they are the future, and as many of us as can be them is very important for NCRP. But I and my parents were discouraged from learning any language other than English. So the Norwegian that my grandmother and my aunt spoke, I did not understand. And the German that my grandfather and my uncles spoke, you also hear the gender division in my grandparents' families. I learned some, and I can read some, but I would never say that I'm fluent. I did, however, have the benefit, and many of you have been born like me into multicultural, multilingual homes, and I have referred to us as born mediators over the years. We intuitively have a sense of how to bridge culture, how to build trust across, difference. And for example, my students on campus at Dominguez Hills from a variety of countries, particularly African nations, have often said to me that they have no problem understanding my lectures in the classroom, as opposed to other American professors who might speak more quickly, not take the time to connect with their students. I've never done research to figure out why this is my life experience, but I believe them and I trust them because this is the world I grew up in. And it's a world that I value. I was not raised in a world that said you need to be loyal only to your own culture and religion and hate the rest, thank God, because I would be ill-suited for NCRP in the world today. Now, I happen to believe, because of my experience and my family's experience, that marrying outside of one's cultural group is a potent vehicle for peace building. And I live in a cross-cultural marriage. My sister fell in love and married an Irishman, a professor of computer engineering, and they have raised their children in Ireland. My family continues to embrace the diversity, the cultural richness of the world today. And if you have not had this life experience, this needs to be part of your NCRP education. Now, I know some of you are in other countries right now, are fully committed to living my life experience. Some of you have come from other countries to the United States. So you intimately understand what I'm talking about. It is a vital introduction to cultural competence. Now, given my multicultural world, I don't believe in cultural competence. If any of you would promote yourself as culturally competent, I would be asking, what are you talking about? Because how do we even become competent with our own cultural experience? And I ask this of Americans all the time. I have lived East Coast. I was born in the South. I have family in Virginia on the coast. I was born actually on the naval base in Portsmouth, Virginia. So military culture is a part of this discussion. But my family then raised me, my mother from Chicago, not the suburbs, but Chicago itself. And my father from southern Wisconsin. They raised me in Milwaukee, and then a very nice suburb of Milwaukee. And I moved to the East Coast after practicing law in the Midwest, in Minneapolis. I have lived in New England. I have lived in lovely progressive Massachusetts, and moved to the West when I started my full-time conflict resolution mediation practice. I have only taught full-time in Western states and have been privileged to live in the Golden State, the paradise of California, both north and south, for the last 20 years. So I've had a very rich, diverse American cultural experience. And so when I ask my American students, what does it mean to be American? They don't often know what to say to me because we are incredibly diverse. If any of you are New Yorkers, you know that your culture is quite distinct from the Californian culture. And if you've lived, as I did, in Northern California, when I taught at UC California, Berkeley, and have now moved to Southern, you know that actually most Californians distinguish between Northern and Southern California. LA urban, totally different than Orange County. Orange County, and please don't, get angry at me for saying this, it's actually factually true, has been the center of hate crimes, prejudice, and discrimination for a long time. Southern Poverty Law Center has been studying Orange County and what's wrong with Orange County for a long time. Totally different than what you will find in Carson, in Compton, in LA itself, night and day worlds. And I'm not even talking about Little Cambodia, Little India, all the ethnic communities of LA. So if you cannot begin to describe your own culture in rich detail, how are you ever going to be culturally competent about another culture? And in my experience, you never will be. There is no such thing as competence. But there are some qualities I would like to mention in my experience are critically important. First of all, an open mind. If you are aware, we all hold bias, we all hold prejudice. That is a human condition. If you are aware of your prejudice and bias, you need to work at eradicating, at challenging, at transforming. And I would suggest you start to get to know whoever you hold that bias about. Now in California, I'll share our hate crime statistics. The people who are most likely to be targeted as the victims of prejudice in Golden, California are still the Jewish community, years after the Holocaust, the gay community, and the African American community. Those are the communities that suffer most because of prejudice and discrimination. And if you happen to be a part of one of those communities or a part of a community that does not know those communities, something needs to happen to help grow your cultural competence. And I'm here to talk about my experience more. I don't have a lot of time today, but for those of you who are not in my intercultural conflict class, which will be starting late September in our next term, that's a very rich course. It tends to be quite diverse, and it's enjoyed. It's a very popular course. I recommend you enroll in that course. I'll have much more time to talk about cultural competence there. The other thing we need to do is acknowledge our limitations. In my work with different languages, different communities around the world, first of all, as I've shared with you, I did not grow up fluent in any language but English. But I would like to say that my emotional intelligence, my intuitive intelligence, from growing up with a variety of languages and cultures has served me well in doing NCRP around the world. if you are not yet in touch with your intuition, your ability to sense what is not being said, your ability to observe and learn about cultures, I would encourage you to find ways to develop your intuition. If you're not curious about people from other cultures, I don't believe you will ever be able to develop any cultural competence. We must have a genuine curiosity to learn. And I find that with most human beings. So I have been privileged to live that. And then the other thing I do, and you'll read about it in both Negotiation Alchemy and Holding These Truths, is I routinely have cultural guides. Now there is a whole translation and interpreter community within NCRP. The Association for Conflict Resolution has had its own special sections for the NCRP translators and interpreters of the world, because what they're doing is not simply linguistics. Those of you who have done some of this work, and even all of us can appreciate this if we reflect on simple language, communication. Culture is so much more. If you have studied and know other languages, let's take Spanish as an important popular example. I could pick Arabic as well. You're just beginning to enter another cultural world. Now, some of you who have studied and learned Spanish have grown up in Spanish-speaking families. So you understand more of the depth and complexity of whatever culture you grew up in, whether it's Mexican, Spanish. But you'll also appreciate that simply because you speak one of the UN languages, you don't necessarily understand the cultures of all the people who speak that language. That is a life journey and adventure. So there needs to be some humility and openness, and I don't have time to talk about working with interpreters and translators, but I will mention that I regularly have cultural guides. Now, why aren't these insiders actually doing the mediation? The truth is that most insiders do not want to do a mediation where there's a troubling conflict between that cultural group and another enemy group. Excuse my language, but I want to make it very clear, because most groups will suspect an impartial insider is being disloyal to them when they are simply acting as an impartial mediator. It's much harder to pull off than it sounds. So generally, they will say no to these mediations and ask for a true outsider, an outsider who can be truly impartial with all groups concerned. But having them as cultural guides has been critically important for my understanding whatever cultures I'm working with. Okay, I've said enough for today. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.